He called me greedy. My future son-in-law, the man who was about to marry my daughter, looked me in the eyes and called me greedy. The words still echo in my head. The irony of it all is almost laughable. Because if it weren't for me, there wouldn't even be a wedding for him to show off at. Let me start from the beginning. My daughter, Claire, has always had a soft heart. Too soft, maybe. She met Daniel a few years ago, charming, polite, well-spoken. The kind of guy who knows how to say all the right things. I'll admit, at first, I was impressed. He treated her well, seemed ambitious. But as the months passed, the cracks began to show. Little comments about money. Subtle digs about rich people wasting cash. It was strange because I never flaunted my wealth. I built my company from nothing, and every dollar I earned was through sweat and sleepless nights. I never owed anyone a thing. When they got engaged, I told Claire I'd take care of the wedding expenses. She hesitated. She knows I'm not one to hand out money easily, but this was my only daughter. I wanted her day to be perfect. I paid for everything. The venue, the catering, the flowers, even Daniel's custom tuxedo. Every detail, covered quietly by me. I didn't brag about it. I didn't want credit. I just wanted to see my little girl happy. But Daniel had other ideas. A few weeks before the wedding, I overheard him talking to his friends. They were drinking in my backyard, my house, my whiskey, my food, and he was running his mouth. Her dad's got deep pockets, he laughed. All that money and he still acts like it's a big deal. He's greedy as hell. His friends laughed with him. Man's got millions and can't even loosen up. Claire says he's controlling, always wants to know where the money goes. I stood there behind the door, every muscle in my body frozen. Greedy? I was the one paying for his dream wedding. I was the one making sure his family didn't spend a single cent. And this ungrateful little man had the nerve to mock me in my own home. I didn't confront him that night. I just walked away. Because when people show you who they are, you don't argue. You plan. 2 days before the wedding, I called my lawyer. The money for the venue, catering, decorations, all of it came from my company accounts. I'd arranged it as a sponsorship deal under my firm's name, something that could be reversed with a single phone call. I made that call. Every payment was pulled back. Contracts were cancelled. The vendors were notified that the wedding was off. That same afternoon, I invited Daniel and his parents over for dinner. They arrived with smiles, clueless. I poured them wine, kept my tone polite. Then, halfway through the meal, I said, "I heard what you said about me, Daniel. About me being greedy." His face went pale. "Sir, I raised my hand. No need to explain. I just wanted you to know, you were right." He looked confused. Then I leaned back and smiled. I am greedy. Greedy enough to want my daughter to have a husband who respects her family. And greedy enough to take back every cent I ever gave you. The silence that followed was delicious. His mother choked on her drink. His father turned bright red. Daniel stammered, trying to explain it was a joke. I simply stood, placed an envelope on the table, and said, "Here's the final invoice from the venue. I suggest you pay it quickly. They don't hold dates for free." The next morning, chaos erupted. His family couldn't cover the costs. The wedding was postponed indefinitely. My daughter was devastated, at first. But once the truth came out, once she heard the recording I played for her, yes, I recorded that backyard conversation, she finally saw him for what he was. She ended the engagement 2 days later. Daniel tried to apologize. Tried to spin the story, saying I'd sabotaged everything because I couldn't stand losing control. I didn't bother responding. I just watched as he packed his things and left her apartment for the last time. Months passed. Claire healed. She's stronger now, wiser. She told me once, "Dad, you always see people's true nature before I do." I smiled but didn't answer. Some lessons, unfortunately, have to be learned the hard way. As for Daniel? Last I heard, he's still struggling to pay off the deposits he signed for under his name. I suppose that's karma, or maybe just math. Either way, I sleep well at night. He called me greedy. But the truth is, I was generous, far more than he ever deserved. And in the end, he learned something important: you don't bite the hand that feeds you, especially when that hand owns the table you're eating at. Months went by after the wedding disaster, and I thought that would be the end of Daniel in our lives. But people like him, they don't vanish quietly. They come crawling back when they realize the world isn't as forgiving as they thought. It was early spring when I got a message from him. Just one line: "Can we talk? I want to make things right." I should have ignored it. But curiosity has always been my weakness. I agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown, a place neutral enough to avoid a scene. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the polished smile, the expensive cologne, the confidence. He looked tired, worn down. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes hollow. He stood when he saw me, extending a shaky hand. "Sir," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." I didn't shake his hand. I just sat down. "Say what you need to say, Daniel." He hesitated, took a deep breath, and started talking. About how he'd lost his job, how his parents had stopped supporting him, how his friends didn't understand. He said he'd been drinking too much, that he missed Claire, that he regretted everything. Then he looked at me, his voice cracking. "I was wrong about you. You weren't greedy. You were protecting her. I see that now." I watched him closely. There was remorse, yes. But not the kind that comes from self-awareness. It was the kind that comes from losing comfort, losing status. Regret born from consequences, not conscience. "You didn't just insult me," I said slowly. "You humiliated my daughter. You lied to her, used her, and mocked her family. You don't get forgiveness for that. You get distance." He lowered his eyes. "I know. But please, just tell her I'm sorry." I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table for the coffee I barely touched. "Tell her yourself," I said. "If you can find the courage." And then I left. That was the last time I saw him in person. But life has a funny way of circling back. 6 months later, I got a call from one of my company's hiring managers. She said a candidate had applied for an entry-level position, a man named Daniel H. She asked if I knew him. I almost laughed. "Yes," I said. "I know him very well." She waited for my response. I could have destroyed his chances right there. One word from me and his resume would have gone straight into the trash. But instead, I said, "Hire him, if he's qualified. Don't let my opinion decide his fate." She seemed surprised. "Are you sure, sir?" "Yes," I replied. "Everyone deserves a chance to start over. Even fools." A week later, he was hired, not knowing I had anything to do with it. I never told him. I wanted him to learn what real integrity looked like, the kind that doesn't need applause. Claire eventually moved on. She met someone new, someone quiet, respectful, grounded. The kind of man who doesn't talk about money, but about building a life. When they got engaged, she asked if I'd pay for the wedding again. I said, no. She looked disappointed for a moment, until I smiled and added, "Because this time, you and your fiancé can handle it together. And that's how it should be." She understood. And that, to me, was the real ending of the story, not revenge, not payback, but growth. As for Daniel, I heard he lasted 6 months at the company before quitting. Something about not feeling respected. I suppose some people never change. He once called me greedy. But in the end, he was the one who could never stop taking. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all, sometimes the people who call you selfish are just angry you stopped giving. I didn't ruin him. Life did that on its own. I just stepped back and let it happen. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply walking away, knowing you never have to lift a finger to watch them fall. A year passed after that final brush with Daniel, and I hardly thought about him anymore. Life moved forward, as it always does. My daughter was thriving, happy, independent, glowing in a way I hadn't seen since before she met him. I had retired from the daily grind of my business, spending more time tending my garden, reading, and enjoying the silence I'd earned. Peace, real peace, is a rare luxury, and I had finally found it. Then one rainy evening, as I sat by the window with a glass of bourbon, I received a message. Unknown number. No name. Just a text that said, "You were right." I stared at it for a while. There was no need to ask who it was. Somehow, I knew. I didn't respond. Some chapters don't need to be reopened. But it lingered in my mind. What had he meant by "you were right"? Right about what? About greed? About love? About the choices he made? Maybe he'd finally learned the lesson the hard way. Or maybe it was just guilt clawing at him in the dark. A few weeks later, I ran into his mother at a charity gala. She looked thinner, older. Grief has a way of carving lines into your face that no cream can smooth. When she saw me, her smile was polite but tense. After some small talk, she sighed and said quietly, "I heard you gave Daniel a chance at your company. That was kind of you." I nodded. Everyone deserves a chance to change. She looked down at her glass. He didn't take it. He got involved with the wrong people again. Lost his savings, lost his friends. He's not doing well. There was a pause. I felt no joy in hearing it. Just a dull sadness, the kind that comes when you see wasted potential. I said, "He'll find his way, if he wants to." She nodded, though her eyes said she wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how fragile people are. One bad decision, one lie, one moment of arrogance, it all unravels so easily. Daniel had been given every chance to be better, to rebuild, to start fresh. But pride, that unrelenting hunger for control and validation, destroyed him faster than I ever could have. Months later, my daughter got married. A small ceremony this time, intimate, elegant, genuine. No grand speeches, no flashing cameras, no guests pretending to care. Just love. When she walked down the aisle, she caught my eye and smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile she'd worn at her first engagement party, it was calm, certain, peaceful. And in that moment, I realized, all the anger, all the disappointment, all the bitterness I'd carried, it didn't matter anymore. After the wedding, I sat alone for a while as the guests laughed and danced. The music faded into the distance, and I looked up at the sky, whispering to myself, "It's over." But life, in its strange symmetry, had one more twist waiting. A few months after Claire's wedding, I was at a construction site for one of my company's new projects. It was a commercial renovation job, nothing fancy. As I walked through the scaffolding, I saw a man hunched over, carrying supplies. His clothes were covered in dust, his hair unkempt, his hands trembling from exhaustion. It took me a moment to recognize him. Daniel. He looked up, and our eyes met. Time froze. His face went pale, and for a split second, I saw the man he used to be, proud, arrogant, untouchable. Then it was gone, replaced by shame. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't move closer. I didn't scold him, didn't pity him. I just nodded once, a small, silent acknowledgement of what was, and what could have been. He nodded back, eyes glistening, and turned away to continue his work. I stood there for a long time, watching him fade into the noise of machinery and dust. And that was the last time I saw him. On the drive home, I realized something. Revenge had nothing to do with what happened between us. It was never about making him suffer. It was about balance, about letting the world correct itself. He called me greedy once, but in truth, he was the one who could never be satisfied. Money, respect, love, he wanted it all without earning it. And in the end, he learned that life doesn't work that way. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. As for me, I found peace in silence, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting to be understood, and just let time reveal the truth on its own. Because sometimes, the sweetest revenge is simply living well, long after the storm has passed. Time has a strange way of softening the edges of even the sharpest memories. Years passed, and the storm that once defined so much of our lives became a distant echo. My daughter, now a mother herself, would sometimes mention Daniel in passing, not with bitterness, but with that quiet tone people use when referring to something they've long made peace with. I admired her for that. She had moved on completely. I, on the other hand, hadn't forgotten. Not out of anger, but out of principle. Men like Daniel leave marks, reminders of what happens when arrogance and greed go unchecked. He was a lesson, not a memory. One evening, I was closing up my office when a letter arrived. A physical one, hand-delivered. My name was written in shaky handwriting on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Sir, I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. I just wanted to say, thank you. For not ruining me when you had the chance. I've been trying to rebuild, little by little. It's not much, but I'm sober now. I'm working again, not proud work, but honest work. I know I can never take back what I said, or what I did. But I hope one day your daughter can forgive me. You were right about everything. Daniel." I sat there for a long time after reading it. The ink had smudged slightly, as if from damp fingers, maybe sweat, maybe tears. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relieved. What I felt was something unexpected, closure. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer of my desk. Then I turned off the light and went home. I never replied. Some words don't need an answer, they just need to be said. A few months later, I ran into a contractor who worked on several of our smaller projects. During our conversation, he mentioned a man named Daniel who had joined his crew, quiet, hardworking, never caused trouble. I didn't say anything, but a small smile crept onto my face. Maybe, after all this time, he'd finally learned. Years passed like that. My daughter's family grew. I became a grandfather, the kind who spoils the kids with candy and stories they probably shouldn't hear yet. Life was good, simple, full. And sometimes, when I sat with my grandkids, watching them laugh and chase each other across the yard, I'd think back to the young man who once called me greedy. I'd wonder if he'd ever found someone new, if he'd ever learned how to love without taking. Then, one morning, I opened the newspaper and saw his name again. Not in a headline, just a small obituary tucked near the bottom of the page. No family listed. No photos. Just a few dry words: Daniel Harper, 36, passed away peacefully at home. I read it twice. Peacefully. That word stuck with me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the print as the morning sun crept across my desk. I thought about all the chances he'd been given, all the bridges he'd burned, and the small spark of decency he'd shown at the end. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, a final attempt to make things right before the curtain falls. That evening, I poured myself a drink and walked out to the garden. The air was cool, the sky turning gold. I raised my glass to the fading light and whispered, "Rest easy, kid. You finally stopped running." And in that quiet moment, I realized something I'd never admitted before: revenge had never satisfied me. It had just distracted me. What truly brought me peace was knowing that time, in its slow and merciless way, had done what it always does: reveal character, heal wounds, and close the circle. My daughter, my family, my life, they'd all moved forward untouched. And Daniel, in his own way, had finally found the stillness he could never manage in life. As the last of the sun dipped behind the trees, I smiled to myself. He called me greedy once. But in the end, the only thing I ever wanted was for my daughter to be happy. And she was. That was enough. That was everything. Because some stories don't end with vengeance or victory, they end with peace. The kind that doesn't come from getting even, but from finally, quietly, letting go. The seasons kept changing, as they always do. The sharp edges of memory turned smooth with time, like stones in a river. Life had settled into a rhythm: quiet mornings, slow afternoons, evenings filled with laughter from my grandchildren echoing through the halls of the house I once thought too big for one man. Every now and then, when the house was still, I'd find myself walking into my study. The drawer was still there. The letter still folded, untouched. I'd take it out sometimes, not to read it again, but just to hold it. The paper had yellowed at the corners, the ink faded slightly, but the weight of it, the story behind it, was as heavy as ever. I never told Claire about the letter. She had her peace, her life, and she didn't need the ghosts of the past creeping into it. But one evening, she asked me something that stopped me cold. "Dad," she said softly, "do you ever think about him? About Daniel?" I looked at her, older now, confident, her wedding ring glinting in the light of the fireplace. There wasn't anger in her eyes anymore, just curiosity, maybe even compassion. "Sometimes," I said truthfully. "Not the man he was when you knew him, but the one he could have been. Life gives people choices, Claire. Some take them and grow. Others waste them and fade. But either way, time does what it's supposed to." She nodded, thoughtful, and after a long pause said, "I used to hate him. But now, I just hope he found peace." I smiled faintly. "He did," I said, meaning it more than she knew. After she left, I went out to the garden. It was late spring, the roses in bloom, the air heavy with the scent of soil and rain. I poured 2 glasses of bourbon and set one down on the small table beside me. "For old time's sake," I muttered. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't nostalgia. It was respect, for the story that had shaped us both. The mistakes, the lessons, the endings we didn't ask for but needed anyway. The night settled around me, quiet and thick. I thought about how differently things could have gone, how easily anger can twist into obsession if you let it. There was a time I wanted Daniel to suffer. I won't pretend otherwise. But standing there, watching the last light fade from the sky, I realized something: forgiveness isn't about saying they deserve it. It's about deciding that you deserve peace. And I had mine. Years later, when I was an old man and my hands had started to tremble, I decided to write everything down, not out of pride, but out of clarity. I wanted my grandchildren to understand something that took me most of a lifetime to learn: that revenge is loud, but wisdom is quiet. That power doesn't come from getting even, it comes from walking away, standing taller, and letting truth do the work for you. I never spoke Daniel's name again after that. His story ended, and ours continued. My daughter built the kind of life every father dreams his child will have. Her home was full of love, laughter, and warmth, the things money can't buy and resentment can't destroy. And every time I visited, I saw it, the peace I had once fought to protect. It was right there, living in her eyes, echoing in the way her children called me Grandpa. Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not what you leave behind in your will, but what you protect with your silence, your choices, your restraint. Daniel once called me greedy. But if wanting the world to be kind to my daughter makes me greedy, then maybe I was. Because in the end, I kept the only treasure that mattered, my family's happiness, untarnished by bitterness, untouched by revenge. And as the years faded into memory, I found myself whispering one final truth to the empty garden, to the ghosts of every choice I'd made: I never wanted to destroy him. I just wanted to save her. And I did. Then I raised my glass to the night sky, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely, utterly free. Time, the patient sculptor, kept chiseling away at me, softer around the eyes, slower in the steps, gentler in the voice. My days grew quieter, my nights longer, but never lonely. There's a kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore, it simply is. Claire's children had grown into young adults by then. The house that once echoed with laughter now carried a comfortable calm. They visited often, still teasing me about my old-fashioned habits and my stubborn insistence on handwriting letters instead of sending messages. One evening, my eldest grandson, Liam, found me sitting on the porch, looking out at the garden. He was 23, sharp-minded, kind-hearted, so much like his mother when she was young. He sat beside me, hands tucked in his pockets. "Grandpa," he said after a while, "Mom told me a little about what happened before she met Dad. About that guy she was engaged to. Daniel, right?" I nodded slowly. "That's right." He hesitated. "She said you handled it differently. That you didn't fight him, or try to get even. You just let life handle him." He looked at me curiously. "Did that ever bother you? Not doing more?" I chuckled softly. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep, not from amusement, but from recognition. "It used to. When I was your age, I thought every wrong needed a hammer. I thought justice had to be loud. But life teaches you otherwise. The world has a way of settling its own debts, all you need is patience." He nodded, thoughtful. Then he said, "Mom says you saved her." I turned to him, the evening light catching the faint lines on my face. "No," I said quietly. "She saved herself. I just cleared the path." He smiled, and for a moment, I saw the reflection of everything I'd fought for: not vengeance, not victory, but legacy. A family untouched by bitterness. A daughter who learned strength through pain. A grandson who'd never have to repeat my lessons the hard way. After he went inside, I sat there a little longer, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint laughter of my family, and it made me smile. In the stillness, I thought again about Daniel. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't even pity him. If anything, I was grateful. Because sometimes it takes a cruel storm to teach you the value of calm waters. Without him, I might never have learned what kind of man I truly was. That night, I took out the old letter one last time. The paper was fragile now, edges fraying. I read the words again, slower this time. There was no anger in them anymore, only a quiet acceptance. A man admitting he'd lost his way, and perhaps, in doing so, finding a sliver of peace before the end. I folded the letter neatly, walked outside to the garden, and placed it beneath the old oak tree, the one I'd planted when Claire was born. I lit a small match, watching as the paper curled and blackened, the flames devouring the last trace of that chapter. When it was gone, only ashes remained, carried off by the wind. I whispered, "Goodbye, Daniel." Not as an enemy. Not even as a warning. Just, as a man to another man whose story had finally reached its end. When I went back inside, I found Claire standing by the door, watching me. She didn't ask what I was doing. She just smiled, a small, knowing smile, and said, "Ready for dinner, Dad?" I nodded, closing the door behind me. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's eat." And that was it. No grand revelation. No cinematic ending. Just a quiet man, an old garden, and a family whole again. Because in the end, life isn't about revenge or redemption. It's about peace. And peace doesn't arrive all at once, it settles in slowly, like the dusk after a long day, soft and certain. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt something deep in my chest, not regret, not pride, just calm. The kind that comes when every story, no matter how painful, finally finds its place. And before I drifted off to sleep, I found myself smiling at a truth I'd earned the hard way: revenge fades. Love remains. And that is enough. The years after that evening blurred together in a gentle rhythm: morning coffee, the hum of the radio, the sound of the wind pushing through the old oak tree out back. Age had settled into my bones like an old friend, one that didn't ask questions, just stayed close. I spent my days watching the world change in small, quiet ways. Claire would visit often, always bringing a homemade pie or photos of the kids. Liam started his own business. The younger one, Sophie, moved abroad. Life went on, beautifully, quietly. One Sunday afternoon, Claire brought her whole family over for dinner. The table was crowded again, full of laughter, stories, the sound of forks scraping plates. At one point, I looked around, and something inside me shifted. The years of struggle, the anger I once carried, the bitterness that had shadowed me, they all felt like they belonged to someone else. I had outlived that man. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I walked out to the porch. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of jasmine. I looked toward the oak tree, taller now, stronger than ever, and thought about all the memories buried beneath its roots. The wedding that never happened. The letter I'd burned. The mistakes, the lessons, the mercy. It was all part of the soil now. I sat down slowly and whispered to the night, "It's all forgiven." Maybe I wasn't talking to Daniel anymore. Maybe I was saying it to myself. Because forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't something you give to others, it's something you give to your own heart when it's tired of carrying weight. As the stars blinked above, I felt a kind of peace that was deeper than anything I'd ever known. The kind that comes not from forgetting the past, but from making peace with it. Years slipped by, quietly and kindly. The world kept spinning, and I moved with it, slower, softer. My steps became shorter, my breath shallower, but my spirit lighter. Then, one morning, I woke up knowing it was time. Not in a morbid way, just a calm awareness that my story had been told. I dressed, brewed my coffee, and sat by the window where the sunlight spilled across the floor. Claire found me there later that day, a faint smile still on my face, my hand resting over a small envelope. Inside, I'd left her a note. Just a few words, really. "My dear Claire, I have lived a good life. A full one. You were always my greatest pride. Don't let anger touch your heart, even when the world tempts you. Let kindness be your revenge, and peace your victory. Love, Dad." They buried me under that same oak tree, the one that had seen every chapter of our story. Claire said a few words, simple but beautiful. And as the wind rustled the leaves above, I'd like to think a small piece of me smiled. Because life, in the end, had come full circle. The man who was once called greedy had left behind nothing but love. The story that began with betrayal ended with grace. And if anyone were to ask, years later, about the man who taught his daughter what peace really meant, they'd point to that tree, still standing tall, roots deep and steady, whispering in the wind, "Revenge fades. Love remains." Claire's family kept the old house after I was gone. She couldn't bring herself to sell it, she said it felt alive, like it still held conversations in its walls. Every spring, she would bring her children and grandchildren back to visit, and they'd spend the day in the garden under the oak tree. The first time they came after my funeral, she brought a small bronze plaque. She placed it at the base of the oak and brushed the soil off gently. The engraving was simple, in loving memory. He taught us that peace outlasts revenge. That line became something of a family motto. Liam used it as a quote on his office wall when his company started to grow. Sophie mentioned it in a speech at her wedding overseas. Each of them, in their own way, carried that quiet philosophy forward. One late summer evening, years later, Claire came back alone. The sun was low, painting everything in a golden haze. She sat by the tree for a long time, her hands resting in her lap, her face older but still radiant. "I finally understand you, Dad," she whispered to the wind. "All those years, I thought you were just being stubborn. But you weren't trying to win. You were trying to teach me how to stop fighting." She smiled, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. "You did. You really did." As the breeze rustled the leaves above, one of the grandchildren, her youngest, a quiet boy named Oliver, came running from the porch. "Grandma, are you talking to Grandpa again?" She laughed softly and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. He listens better than most people, you know." Oliver grinned, sat beside her, and looked up at the branches swaying gently in the light. "Mom says he used to sit out here every night." "She's right," Claire said. "He said this tree reminded him of life, strong roots, quiet growth, and branches that keep reaching higher, even when they've seen storms." The boy looked thoughtful for a moment. "Do you think he's proud of us?" She smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I don't think. I know." They sat there together, the air humming softly with cicadas, the smell of earth and memory thick around them. When they finally stood to leave, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the first stars were beginning to show. Claire turned for one last look at the tree, at the plaque glinting faintly in the fading light. "Good night, Dad," she said quietly. "We're still keeping the peace, just like you taught us." And maybe, just maybe, if anyone had been listening closely enough, they might have heard the faintest whisper of wind through the leaves. Not words exactly, but something that felt like a blessing. Because stories like ours don't really end. They settle, deep into the soil, passed down in roots and remembered in laughter, teaching those who come after that strength isn't in the revenge you take, but in the peace you leave behind. And so the tree stood, year after year, through every season, a quiet monument to a man who once learned the hardest way that forgiveness doesn't erase history, it redeems it. The garden grew wild around it, but the oak never faltered. Its branches reached higher, its roots dug deeper, and every spring, when the wind swept through, the leaves would whisper the same quiet truth that had defined his life: revenge fades. Love remains. Peace endures. As the years went on, the oak tree became more than just a symbol for the family, it became a gathering place for generations who had never even met the man who planted it. Every summer, without fail, they held a small picnic there. No speeches, no ceremonies. Just laughter, food, and stories shared in the shade. Liam's daughter, Emma, grew up hearing the tale of the quiet man who chose peace. To her, it was almost mythical, a story that sounded too gentle to be true in a world that thrived on outrage and retribution. When she turned 16, she asked her mother, was he really that forgiving? Didn't he ever get angry? Claire smiled at her and said, "Oh, he got angry, sweetheart. He just learned what to do with it. He didn't let it rot inside him." Emma didn't fully understand then. But she would, someday. One autumn, long after Claire had grown older and her steps had slowed, she returned to the house again, this time not with family, but with a small box. Inside it were letters. Old ones. The kind written on yellowed paper in her father's unmistakable handwriting. She had found them tucked inside a drawer when she was cleaning out her attic. They weren't addressed to anyone in particular. Some were just reflections, thoughts he'd never shared aloud. She sat under the oak, unfolding each one carefully, the air cool and crisp, the smell of earth strong after a morning rain. One letter read, "If you ever find these words, it means time has already taken me. Don't let grief harden you. Life has a way of testing you through people who don't deserve your anger but will earn your patience. Remember, revenge may satisfy your pride, but forgiveness satisfies your soul. Another letter simply said, "You'll know I'm still with you when the wind moves through this tree. That's how I'll speak." Claire closed her eyes then, listening. The wind picked up, brushing through the leaves, a low whisper that felt almost alive. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't magic. It was memory, the kind that hums quietly through everything you love. When she finally passed years later, they buried her beside the oak. Her children placed her letters in a small wooden box and buried it between their graves. On the new plaque, they added one final line beneath the original inscription, "And she carried his peace forward." Time, as it always does, kept moving. The world outside grew louder, faster, more restless. But in that small garden, beneath the shade of the old oak, there was stillness, a quiet pocket of eternity where one man's choice to forgive had echoed across decades. Every once in a while, a stranger passing through the town would see the tree, the plaques, the weathered bench nearby, and ask about it. And someone, usually a great-grandchild by then, would smile and say, "It's a long story. But it starts with a man who could have chosen revenge, and didn't." The stranger might nod, intrigued, and ask, "And what happened to him?" And the child, with the easy confidence of someone who knows the answer by heart, would smile softly and say, "He found peace. And he left it here for the rest of us." Then they'd walk away, leaving the visitor to stand in the shade of that towering oak, feeling the hush of wind through the leaves, that same whisper that had traveled through generations, carrying a single truth that time had never managed to erode: revenge dies. Peace lives. Love remains. Always. Decades later, the world around the old house had changed beyond recognition. What used to be a quiet countryside was now a small, growing town. The dirt roads had turned into asphalt, the farmlands into housing estates, and the once distant hum of the city had crept closer with every passing year. Yet, somehow, that oak tree, tall, ancient, and unwavering, still stood. The family had long since spread across continents. Some lived overseas, others in busy cities, chasing dreams that stretched far beyond what their ancestors had ever imagined. But no matter how far they went, they all came back, every 10 years, for what they called the gathering. It wasn't formal. No speeches, no photos for show. Just family. Dozens of them, from toddlers with curious eyes to elders with trembling hands, all sitting beneath the same tree. They'd bring food, laughter, and stories that began the same way every time. "Your great-great-grandfather taught us something." At one such gathering, a young man named Noah, one of Liam's great-grandsons, stood quietly apart from the others. He was in his 20s, and life had already begun to chip away at him. He'd recently lost a business partner who had betrayed him, stolen from him, and ruined his reputation. The bitterness sat heavy in his chest like a stone. As the others talked and laughed, Noah stared at the plaque under the oak tree, the words catching in the sunlight, "He taught us that peace outlasts revenge." He scoffed under his breath. "Easy to say," he muttered. "But he never lived in my world." A gentle voice came from behind him. It was an elderly woman, one of Claire's daughters, now well into her 80s. Her eyes were soft, her voice warm but firm. "He said the same thing once," she told him. Noah turned. "Who?" "Your great-grandfather. When he was about your age, he thought peace was weakness. That forgiveness was letting people win. But he learned something different, and it changed him, and all of us." Noah frowned. "I just don't see how forgiving someone like that makes things better." "He ruined my life." The woman nodded slowly. "Maybe. But if you let that anger live in you, he'll keep ruining it. Every day." Noah looked down, silent. The woman smiled faintly and touched the plaque with wrinkled fingers. "He once wrote, 'Peace doesn't mean forgetting the hurt. It means refusing to let the hurt own you. Then she walked away, leaving Noah there under the spreading branches. He sat down on the old bench, staring at the roots breaking through the soil. He didn't pray, didn't speak, just listened. The wind began to move through the leaves, that familiar, low whisper that every generation had come to recognize. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange comfort, as though the earth itself was breathing calm into his restless heart. Noah stayed there until sunset. When he finally stood up, he felt lighter. Not healed, not yet, but ready. Ready to let go of the poison before it became permanent. He pulled out his phone and, for the first time in months, sent a message to the man who had betrayed him. It wasn't long or emotional. Just 3 words, "I forgive you." The message wasn't for the other man, it was for himself. As the years went on, Noah built his life again. He became a husband, then a father. And when his own children were old enough, he brought them to the oak tree. He told them about the man who started it all, the quiet father-in-law, the so-called greedy man who chose to teach peace instead of revenge. And when he finished the story, his daughter, a little girl with wide, wondering eyes, asked him softly, "Do you think he can still hear us?" Noah smiled, feeling the wind stir again. "I think he never stopped listening." The leaves above rustled, and the sun broke through the branches, scattering light across the ground. And in that golden warmth, another generation learned the lesson that had outlived time itself, that the truest kind of revenge isn't destruction, it's peace. The kind that roots itself deep, grows tall, and shades everyone who comes after. The oak tree stood, its branches reaching toward the sky, its roots heavy with memory, and the wind whispered again, eternal, soft, certain, peace outlasts revenge. Love outlives pain. And some legacies never die. And so, the story came full circle, beginning with anger, ending in peace. What started as a wound of betrayal grew into a legacy of forgiveness that outlived every name, every grudge, every fleeting storm. The oak tree still stands, its roots deep in the same soil where one man once buried his pain and planted his wisdom instead. Generations have come and gone, yet its branches keep reaching higher, carrying whispers of lessons that time could never silence. He was once just a father, a man insulted, misunderstood, and pushed to bitterness. But instead of letting darkness define him, he chose grace. And in doing so, he became something far greater than he ever intended, a reminder that revenge may satisfy the moment, but forgiveness sustains eternity. Now, when the wind moves through that old oak and the sunlight filters through its leaves, you can almost hear it, that quiet echo that has guided his family for decades. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply whispers the truth he lived and died by: revenge fades. Love remains. Peace endures. Always.